The third and final defunct Japanese company we're covering is, well, unquestionably the biggest disaster of the lot. It might not actually be as well known as the other two, certainly not as well known as Hustle, but the story of World Japan has everything. Political intrigue and machinations, profligate spending, hideous incompetence, legends embarrassing themselves, the ill-advised mixing of work and shoot, fatal negligence. It's got the lot. World Japan might just, in fact, be the single most incompetent attempt at starting a major wrestling promotion in the history of pro-res. It makes SWS, for example, look positively spectacular. The only real thing in its favour was that it didn't last awfully long. It barely even reached a year in existence before finally, mercifully, the plug was pulled on the whole thing. Hell, there's not even that much footage of them out there. They only ever ran one show that could be considered even close to major. That was their first one, and it was kind of a flop. It's just an absolute catastrophe fuck of a promotion. How so? Well, keep watching. We've got plenty to get through. So the main man we're covering for the story is one of Puro's foremost legends, Riki Choshu. I suppose the odd thing with Choshu is that if you're in any way familiar with Puro, you'll know his name. He is after all one of the biggest draws in Pro-Res's history. Most people may not be as familiar with his work as they are with others, mind. It depends on how much you get into early 80s New Japan, I guess, but people always seem to gravitate more towards the technicals, the storytellers and the juniors, often bypassing the more power-based likes of Choshu. Hell, maybe the first thing that springs to mind when Choshu is mentioned is Scorpion Deathlock, or Sharpshooter. He invented the move, after all. Still, from his rise to prominence in early 80s New Japan onwards, this is a huge name we're talking about. When New Japan started floundering in the mid-part of the decade, he did the unthinkable and jumped ship to the other side, starting the Ishingun Army storyline in All Japan. Again, one of the biggest storylines of the whole decade. Then he shockingly crossed the floor again, back to New Japan. A move that didn't necessarily sit well with other people, particularly Akira Maeda who, in events we've previously covered, shoot-kicked Choshu in the face during a tag match. The combined heat and overness of these two, especially after this event, may well have resulted in the single biggest match in modern Puro history, but alas it never happened. Still, as the 90s rolls on and Choshu gets older, he becomes more important in the back than he does in the ring. When Choshu returned, Antonio Inoki gave him the book. It's a position that Choshu would hold on to for 12 years through the course of the company's most successful ever period. Choshu's achievements as a booker are legendary. He created the G1 Climax tournament for a start. And yes, he did make sure to book himself to win it once, in 1996. He booked more sellout successors in the Tokyo Dome than literally anybody else. He built stars almost in his own image, using a philosophy of youngsters rebelling against the older guard and achieving prominence that way, just how he'd become a name back in the early 80s. Using this philosophy, New Japan's younger superstars, particularly Shinya Hashimoto, Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono, usually dubbed the Three Musketeers, flourished. Hashimoto in particular is one of the biggest stars in the history of Pro-Res. So you've got all this, you've got high quality cards, particularly a glorious junior division featuring the likes of Jushin Thunder Liger, El Samurai, Shinjiro Otani, Ultimo Dragon and, yes, Chris Wild Pegasus Benoit. You've got the lot, basically. 90s New Japan is still a high watermark for the company, to be honest. Even when you look at the quality of the promotion right now, it was a glorious time. Still, while Choshu is rightly thought of as one of the most successful bookers of all time, he never felt fully secure in his position. In many ways he was similar in style to Dusty Rhodes with the book, in that he didn't always make friends with everyone and didn't necessarily take criticism all that well. Now perhaps there was good reason to be this way, to always have that edge of paranoia. In the world of Major League Puro, the knives are seemingly always out for you, after all. Grand politicking actions don't necessarily take place behind the scenes either. They can happen right out in the open, on camera, or in the pages of Weekly Pro Wrestling. When Riki Choshu wrestled his retirement matches on the January 4th 98 Tokyo Dome show, Antonio Inoki couldn't help but undercut it completely by announcing his own retirement match on the same night to take place 3 months later. That's just the sort of shit which happens in Japan. We always talk about big political players like Hogan or Triple H or whoever in the West, but a lot of what they do purely happened behind the scenes. Imagine the same things happening, only with justification and explanation fully out there for all to see in interviews and the like, keeping up the veneer of the sportesque presentation. That's what pro-res is. Anyway, as long as results are still good, the politics ain't really going to harm you. But the second that things start to waver, that's when the knives get sharpened. The crushing blow for Choshu as a booker came in January 2002, when Keiji Muto shockingly crossed the floor to All Japan, a company most thought was going to die in the wake of the mass exodus of stars that resulted in pro wrestling Noah. The departure of Muto, coupled with various injuries, and others such as young ace Satoshi Kojima following in Muto's wake, because almost any major wrestler has a crew of others, big and small, whom they trained or otherwise took under their wing, and this bond is really strong indeed in Puro, way more so than it is in the West, left New Japan short on star power and a furious Inoki looking for somebody to blame. Inevitably, he and the eyes of the rest of New Japan's board, including company president and fellow legend Tatsumi Fujinami, falls on Choshu. Choshu paid the price at the annual shareholders meeting, walking away from his head booker position before being pushed out of it, whilst one of his key allies, general manager Katsuji Nagashima, also got the axe. Choshu is replaced as booker by Masahiro Chono. And the impact of this decision is going to affect others who are closely associated to Choshu. You can count on that. Let's bring Kensuke Sasaki into the discussion. In 2000 and early 2001, he was finally enjoying a run essentially at the very top of the company, headlining the major Tokyo Dome shows without question. But Sasaki was one of Choshu's guys, someone who Choshu trained in fact. So, when Choshu was put out, his star almost immediately waned, getting thrust into a strange sort of shooter gimmick that didn't really fit him at all, complete with banter quality MMA win against some complete bum in America. Sasaki never cared much for Inokiism, and so from this point on he was thought of as unhappy in New Japan. There was even a planned MMA fight against, of all people, Minoru Suzuki. Sasaki undoubtedly knew he was certain to be crushed by a Misu who back then was far more known for his legit exploits in Pancrase as opposed to pro wrestling, and so he engineered a pullout. As a result of this, a game but way overmatched Jushin Liger got destroyed in his place. Choshu, for his own part, tried to bring back some of New Japan's star power by ending his retirement and returning to Lorraine, something he previously swore he'd only ever do if business started to turn sour, and guess what, it kind of was. But this didn't exactly go brilliantly. On May 3rd, 2001, a tag match at the Fukuoka Dome saw Choshu and young enforcer type Manabu Nakanishi go up against Naoya Ogawa and Kazunari Murakami, two shooters. Naoya Ogawa, former Olympic judoka, is the biggest mainstream star New Japan can call on at the time, thanks to the legendary bouts he had with Shinya Hashimoto. And the big hype of this match of Choshu versus Ogawa, the other two names in the win are totally unimportant, results in a massive 21.1 TV rating, equal to nearly 30 million people watching at home. But the match itself? Complete disaster. Ogawa utterly sandbags and half shoots on the nearly 50-year-old Choshu, making him look absolutely terrible. The morning's papers were speculating on whether Riki Choshu could consider retiring for good. It was that awful. I mean, what happened? Did Ogawa, by this point essentially the Japanese Goldberg, go into business for himself? Or was he told to do it? And if so, by whom? Even the drawing power of someone like Choshu never fully recovered from this total mess. Injuries saw him become less of a presence on the New Japan card, and by the end of 2001, it seemed to most people as if Choshu's time at New Japan was coming to an end. And indeed, they'd be right. With no real responsibilities left in the company, and a considerable pay cut looming on the horizon, Riki Choshu finally handed in his full resignation on April 8, 2002. The news didn't even come out until about a month later, and he left under something of a cloud. His then final match for the company, in his hometown of Tokushima, took place with almost no fanfare, resulting in a shockingly small crowd of only 2,800. This is quite in contrast to the usual fond farewell given to major wrestlers, it has to be said. Choshu lambasted Inoki's constant interference at all levels in the press, and said that he finally understood why Giant Baba had never trusted Inoki. Inoki didn't say too much, but in comments that did prove somewhat foreboding, he did accuse Choshu of spending far too much money, as well as earning too much. President Tatsumi Fujinami, essentially president in little but name seeing as Inoki held the majority interest, also came down hard against Choshu, claiming he was irresponsible and spent little time in the office performing duties, therefore he should have understood the management's position and why he was due a cut in salary. And again, all of this took place in public. Hell, this sort of news even featured at times on New Japan's weekly TV programme. Can you imagine if WWE Raw started off with a segment covering Vince McMahon's comments at a quarterly shareholders meeting? It's kind of like that. Things are very different indeed. Naturally, there was huge amounts of speculation on just what Riki Choshu was going to do next. Cross the floor to All Japan? They were interested, make no mistake. There were plenty of major programs that Choshu could have done there. One of the more obvious ones would be a program with Genichiro Tenryu. Choshu and Tenryu had been friends for many years, and if they were going to do a program together, then All Japan would probably be the most natural place for it. 01 were also naturally interested for similar reasons. Simply replace Tenryu with Shinya Hashimoto and you've got another big program. One that also had the added edge of historical political shenanigans, seeing as Choshu was the main man given public credit for firing Hashimoto from New Japan in 2001. Of course, there's not a huge amount stopping Choshu from doing both of these things. He'd be a big draw as a freelancer, and doing that would make him able to work both All Japan and 01 at some point. A lot of effort was put into making these programs happen, although they never did, at least not in these promotions. There were other more outlandish thoughts. 01 did put a fair bit of effort into coaxing Akira Maeda out of retirement, with naturally the thought of finally running Maeda vs Choshu. Hell, even though it had been nearly 15 years since that incident, they thought it might sell tickets still. But nah, never came close to happening, and Maeda just stayed retired. The most ridiculous thought of them all? Riki Choshu versus Rickson Gracie. Seriously, in what? A wrestling match? An MMA fight? Who even knows? It would have been an absolute joke, of course, but this was an encounter that people had spread rumours about for years, one of the legit tough wrestlers versus a legit tough shooter. And with Choshu now free of New Japan, those whispers started again. Needless to say, I highly doubt that there was anything even close to negotiations that took place with a view to this fight happening. It'd have certainly generated interest, much like Nobuhiko Takada and Rickson did, but yeah, ridiculous. As far as Choshu was concerned, he was taking a little break and not making any snap decisions. Still, the possibility of him starting a promotion was always there. His former New Japan ally, Katsuji Nagashima, had already talked about it in the press, and it was only ever going to happen with Riki Choshu. If a new promotion happened, most expected that the want-away Kensuke Sasaki would get involved with it, probably along with old Choshu allies and friends such as Tenryu, Shiro Koshinaka, and Yoshiaki Yatsu. Perhaps a younger New Japan guy would join them. The thought here was that it would be one of the following: Kenzo Suzuki, Shinya Makabe, later Togi Makabe, or Hiroshi Tanahashi. These would be the major foundation stones of Choshu's new promotion. However, it was generally believed that Choshu and Nagashima didn't have enough money or resources to start this promotion off their own backs. But, in the end, they did find their money mark. In the autumn of 2002, Choshu and Nagashima secured the investment of Seiji Fukuda, an entrepreneur from Hokkaido. And so what was currently known as the Riki Nagashima project gradually began to take an actual form. In October of 2002, Kensuke Sasaki does what was generally expected. He resigns from New Japan, the promotion he'd resided in for his whole career up to this point, unhappy with the current company direction. Privately, a lot of thought had gone into the decision, with various people such as Fujinami and Seiji Sakaguchi pushing for Sasaki to stay, whereas others such as Chono and Yuji Nagata had kinda wanted him gone. Ultimately, he decided to take off. Again, there's lots of intrigue, much speculation as to whether the announcement of Sasaki's departure was purposefully timed by Choshu and Nagashima to take a little bit of shine off of New Japan's announcement of an angle involving the then huge name that was Bob Sapp. For their part, New Japan ran an interview with Shinya Makabe, back from excursion, talking about how Sasaki had bullied him and other youngsters in training. On November the 12th, Choshu and Nagashima finally ran a press conference to announce their new promotion's official name, Fighting of World Japan Pro Wrestling, or simply World Japan. Their first show, titled MAGMA 01, is slated to take place on March 1st, 2003 at a pretty large venue, the 10,000 plus seater Yokohama Arena, with a big main event featuring Choshu and Tenryu in an old FMW style no rope exploding barbed wire match. This FMW style match does take place, but they run it instead with Shiro Kashinaka and the master of such matches himself, Mr. Liar, the Wild Finn, and another lens-sitting politician, Atsushi Onita. Onita's a pretty big get for World Japan to go alongside the obvious ones like Tenryu, Sasaki, Koshinaka and Yatsu, while Takeo Omori and Kenzo Suzuki make the jump from Noah and New Japan respectively. Both of these guys should have been bigger than they were. Omori, previously one half of the No Fear tag team and the one most tipped for single success as opposed to Yoshihiro Takayama, never recovered from calling an early end to a very stiff match against Shinya Hashimoto in Noah. He clearly lost the respect of Mitsuharu Misawa from doing that, and for the past couple of years he'd barely been a curtain jerker while ex-partner Takayama became a star. Kenzo Suzuki, an ex-rugby player, was well hyped in New Japan and had a very good look indeed, but unfortunately he was something of a lummox in the ring who was yet to really connect with fans. That said, he was still young and, while still kind of subpar, he was at least improving year on year. Still, generally way overpushed. Rounding off, there's a few promising youngsters. The incredibly young Katsuhiko Nakajima, the somewhat grisly looking but shockingly still quite young then Tomohiro Ishii, and American imports. We've got those old chestnuts, the Road Warriors, a burly American duo known as the Crushers, otherwise known as the Shane Twins and most familiar to people as mid-noughties WWE boys stables shoo-ins, the Gemini, as well as a couple of popular indie names. Homicide and the Spanish announce team, Jose and Joel Maximo, would also make appearances for World Japan during their brief run. So, what of that show then? It did indeed happen on March 1st, 2003, at the Yokohama Arena, in front of a billed audience of 13,000 or so. It's a stacked card to be sure, although one has to wonder how much of it was papered, especially considering that other big shows from Noah and K1 were running on that day. However, March 1st was the only date they could get. To put the show in context, MAGMA 01 took place on the same evening that, in Noah, Mitsuharu Misawa finally passed the torch and GHC Heavyweight Championship to Kenta Kobashi in a beyond epic main event that, for many, is still the greatest match in company history. Could World Japan's show pull off anything as dramatic as that? No, not even close. The big problem with World Japan from watching their shows is, to be honest, perfectly clear. Just from the first show and onwards, you can quite clearly see that it's mostly nothing but a bunch of old gits. Even though a lot of them were famous and talented old gits, and hell, they're mostly pretty damn far from being washed up old gits at this point, it's still primarily old git central, with just about everyone involved having already made their fame in other promotions. In short, it's the Japanese NWA TNA. Of course, you did have some truly washed up old gits. I mean, the Road Warriors? Not too great to watch in 2003. Hawk was clean then, to be fair, but Animal and the team in general had kind of had their day. They mostly wrestled against the Crushers, with both sides sharing wins. In fact, the last match that the original Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, wrestled together took place in a World Japan Ring on the 11th of July, beating the Shane Twins once again. It's Hawk's second to last match before his sudden passing in October. There's other American imports who are past their sell-by date. Dr. Death Steve Williams is just not a good watch in 2003, and sadly nor is Vader. By this point they're both fully broken down. It's not fun to watch these once great behemoths limp about at all, in fact. On the Japanese side, it's not much better. There are the good ones, of course. Tenryu is still great despite being over 50. While far from a full-timer due to politics, as in actual politics, not wrestling politics, Hiroshi Hase is brilliant on command. Choshu looks invigorated after injuries had mostly put him out of the ring for nearly a year. And then you've got guys like Kensuke and Koshinaka who are pretty much still in their prime, or at least only a couple of years out of it, so they're obviously value. Anita? Forget it. While you never exactly watch Anita for the wrestling anyway, World Japan's attempts at recreating FMW-era explosions and that were, in a word, pathetic. Like one of those shitty indoor fireworks. and in the end political commitments meant that Anita had to pull out from the promotion early anyway. You've got the younger folks, of course, but it's not much good there. Omori, Kenzo Suzuki? No. World Japan wanted these guys to be their main eventers, but it didn't stick before and it wasn't going to stick now. There's Dan Bobish too, mainly a 0-1 project. Some people clearly saw him as the next Vader, particularly with his legit MMA background. But again, it just didn't go. He simply wasn't good enough in the ring. What potential there is lies at the very lower end of the card. There's that Tomohiro Ishii guy with the quiff who's clearly got something. Ishii, then aged 28, believe it or not, was a Tenryu and Choshu project who'd been going a few years, and he was trying to make the most of this chance. Then there's Katsuhiko Nakajima. I mean, he doesn't wrestle much because he's 15 at this stage. The guy's clearly an ace even if he's only doing karate demos, and he will become a big name for the next 20 years. Just, not here. It's not as if the roster of World Japan is too bad on paper, but when it all comes together it feels a little bit like a nostalgia tour, a vanity project where nothing really means anything. Prognostications for World Japan were very poor basically from the beginning, with many commenters wondering just what on earth they were planning to offer in what was by this point a very, very dense market. In the early 2000s, Puro gets to a stage where damn near every big name wrestler has their own promotion. It's as if Shinya Hashimoto started the ball rolling when he formed 0-1, and now everyone wants to have a go. Exactly what was World Japan going to bring to the table? There were too bloody many of these promotions clogging up the indie scene, in many ways interchangeable from one another. Hell, they'd often have to team up on cards to generate any kind of audience. When you take a long, hard look at the Puro scene in 2003, you can see that something's going to break, that it's due a big crash. And thanks to the sheer density of the scene and the pressures of MMA biting harder and harder, it was coming, believe me. So World Japan as a promotion just kind of plods on. The decent audience for their first show basically represents their only success. It certainly didn't last when the promotion went out there more often. By the summer, audience numbers were in the toilet. They ran the 6,700-seater Osaka Prefectural Gym for a one-night tournament to crown their tag champions, and claimed an audience of about 2,800. Now that's not a good number to begin with, but Puro promotions always inflate their attendance. So the actual number? About 1,000. Things are so bad that even the inflated numbers aren't good. Champions are crowned, at least. Riki Choshu and Genichiro Tenryu get the tag titles, while Kensuke Sasaki wins another one-night tournament to become the inaugural heavyweight champion, beating Kenzo Suzuki in the final. Both the Choshu Tenryu team and Sasaki would be the only champions in World Japan's mercifully short existence, which, as many predicted, would soon be coming to an end. Although the scale of the disaster was a shock and a sadly quite tragic one. Believe it or not, World Japan also had a dojo. Now you may wonder why a vanity promotion like WJ would need a dojo, but there you are. In truth, it's pretty freaking common regardless of a promotion's size. I suppose in one way it demonstrates Riki Choshu's dedication to the project, securing a place where World Japan could potentially train homegrown stars. On the other hand, it also demonstrated one of Choshu's other talents, spending money. A hell of a lot of yen was spent on building said dojo, as well as other important things such as a new car, for Choshu obviously, a big tour bus, a massive year-end party in 2002 attended by all manner of celebrities for the purpose of promoting the World Japan name, putting his daughters through college in the UK, and all this was investors' money. Before bell time on World Japan's first show, Riki had spent nearly $2 million on all these things and more. He's, not exactly careful with cash, to say the least. Anywho, you may have found some potential stars in World Japan's dojo, including a man who was a little bit of a wild card. Takayuki Okada, better known to Japanese audiences as Giant Ochiai, had done a little bit of wrestling for Battle Arts in the 2000s, but he was primarily known as a heavyweight MMA fighter. He got something of a cult following in Pride, both for being a not necessarily skilled but certainly game striker, and for having a bit of charisma. He had a great look and colourful entrances, usually sporting a comically large fake afro that covered up his smaller but still impressive real afro. He didn't have the most impressive record and in the end decided that pro wrestling may be more of his thing, so in 2003 he reported to the World Japan Dojo for full training, although he would still take part in the odd MMA fight. In May 2003 he fought out a pretty brutal 2-round draw with Vengador Barikwa in the Deep promotion. On July 28th, Ochiai was training with Kensuke Sasaki, and Choshu was supervising. The details aren't fully known, but Ochiai had some sort of accident. He suffered a subdural hematoma and ultimately slipped into a coma, which he would never come out of. 11 days after the accident, Ochiai passed away on August the 8th. Very few details ever came out about the incident. All that was ever said was that Ochiai took a bad bump and was knocked out. World Japan generally handled the incident terribly, being very quick to say that they would take absolutely no responsibility for what happened, seemingly more concerned about the possibility of a lawsuit than anything else. This really didn't go down well with wrestling fans, nor did it sit well with those close to Ochiai, such as K1 star Masaki Satake, who was vocally very critical of World Japan's vague account. Regardless of what actually happened, the incident was the end for Kensuke Sasaki in World Japan. His contract was quietly terminated and he was pulled from all future shows. Was this a punishment as such? Well, going by all accounts, what happened was a freak accident, the sort of thing that sadly can just happen. With the benefit of hindsight and going by what we know now about head injuries, one may wonder if Ochiai was suffering after effects from his last MMA fight, which had only taken place a couple of months prior and was quite the slugfest. Equally, the vagueness of the accounts of the incident don't do anyone any favours. It makes it appear as though some sort of negligence definitely took place, and that World Japan had decided to drop Sasaki at least temporarily until the heat cooled off. As it is, World Japan wouldn't survive long enough for Kenzo to return anyway. While there's rumours of him quitting the business altogether, he's not seen anywhere until, quite surprisingly, he resurfaces in WWE in early 2004, where he goes on to be utterly awful for the next 2 years. It's almost typical of the time. Of all the Japanese wrestlers WWE could have signed, they go ahead and sign a big talentless lug like Kensuke Sasaki. The Ochiai scandal also spells the end in World Japan for Yoshiaki Yatsu, Choshu's longtime friend and collaborator. Not that he was involved, he just left in disgust and certainly didn't mince his words in the media afterwards. Yatsu stated, bluntly, that Choshu had no idea whatsoever how to run an indie promotion, or indeed how independent wrestling worked. He continued to lambast Choshu's excessive spending that was still going on even when wrestlers were expected to take massive pay cuts come October when everyone's year-long contracts were up, and quipped that the MAGMA name World Japan often used was appropriate because the promotion was a death volcano waiting to explode. And he's far from the only one to see the writing on the wall. From August onwards, Genichiro Tenryu starts to no-show, pretty clearly wanting to get as far away from World Japan as possible, and many others are quite clearly of the same mind. It's only a shame that these friendships weren't the biggest things lost during the life of this miserable promotion. So, with all of this done, how do we go about making things even worse? Well, how about an MMA show? How's about spunking away even more money on an utterly desperate attempt to ride the coattails of the new combat sports hotness in Japan? Yeah, that's what happened. On September 6, 2003, World Japan get the cage out and run their first and only MMA show, called X1. As usual, they massively overestimate interest, holding it at the 6,000 plus seater Yokohama Bunker Gym. Guess how many fans they attracted? 900. They could not even break 4 figures for this shit. The card is sort of intriguing, on paper, in retrospect. There's some known names dotted around. Daniel Puder, most famous for being on Tough Enough and nearly breaking Kurt Angle's arm, won a match on the card, as did future UFC welterweight and king of wrestle fucking John Fitch, who thankfully has some video evidence available for this show. Katsuhiko Nakajima also won a match on the card aged just 15, at the time making him the youngest MMA competitor ever, while Kensuke Sasaki and Dan Bobish also won matches. The general quality of the fights was apparently dreadful, however, as was the production on the show. Apparently the cage started falling down near the end, meaning it literally had to be held up by hand during the last couple of matches. What a joke. Apparently Choshu stormed out of the show as soon as it had finished, refusing any questions from the media. Instead, the media was filled with more withering comments from the likes of Yoshiaki Yatsu. It's clear that Choshu knew as much about the world of MMA as he did about independent wrestling, I'm afraid to say. The unmitigated disaster of X1, along with everything else, proved to be as much as most of World Japan's money men could take. Seiji Fukuda, the promotion's main investor, pulled out soon after. Apparently there was a new investor, someone mysterious named Mr. M, apparently. So, yeah. Mind you, it seems clear that by this point Mr. M was actually Kensuke Sasaki. Somehow Sasaki was convinced by Choshu to go in on World Japan with his own money, to the tune of around 5 million yen for the sake of funding shows. Shows that were, by this stage, mysteriously getting pulled, if they ever even existed at all. Ridiculously, World Japan promote a card that's going to take place at Korakuen Hall on October 22nd, only for it to be pointed out that a boxing event is scheduled to take place on the same day. This sort of shit is where Kensuke Sasaki's savings are going, in a year where his wife, Joshi legend Akira Hakuto, gave birth to their second son. Poor bastard. It won't surprise you to learn that Sasaki and Choshu's friendship took something of a big hit thanks to the whole World Japan fiasco. I mean, it really shouldn't surprise you, seeing as Choshu behaved like a complete arsehole throughout this whole shit show. It turns out that just because you're a legendary wrestler, hell even just because you're a great booker, doesn't mean you can run a promotion. For all his successes in wrestling, World Japan saw Choshu be incompetent and clueless from the start, all the way to the merciful end. By this point, at the end of 2003, World Japan was essentially done. As expected, almost nobody renewed their contracts come October, basically killing the promotion. Kensuke Sasaki certainly didn't. He made his way back to New Japan in November. Most of the people involved with the company continued their careers with little lasting damage, with Sasaki providing a certain template for New Japan guys. He comes back and gets a lot of heat in a big feud with Yuji Nagata, the ultimate New Japan loyal and defender of the faith. It's almost as if World Japan was all just a setup for a January 4th Tokyo Dome show match. When the young Katsuhiko Nakajima surfaced in New Japan in 2004, it was treated as his full debut in wrestling. In his case, it's like the World Japan stuff never even freaking happened. It all works out in the end. Sasaki becomes a freelancer under his own K-Office brand, taking Nakajima under his wing. His work becomes better than ever, exemplified by that unreal match he had with Kobashi on Noah's July 2005 Destiny card. And ultimately, the official end of World Japan comes when Riki Choshu, tail tucked firmly between his legs, returns to New Japan in the spring of 2004. Much like Sasaki, he has a feud with Yuji Nagata. Ultimately, after a couple of years, he regains the head booker position, and eventually does return to indie promotions with a new brand, Riki Pro. However, this was understandably on a much smaller scale. With the other two promotions we've covered, SWS and Hustle, I could at least think of some pretty positive things to say about them. I could give them a place in Puro history, credit for a bit of influence and all that. But in the case of World Japan, I can't. There was nothing good about it at all, nothing influential. After it had finally given up the ghost, most of the people involved tried to pretend that it never happened. It is quite assuredly the worst attempt at starting a major league promotion in the history of pro res, and it's a lasting black mark on Riki Choshu's reputation. The only good thing you could say really is that it gave early exposure to the likes of Katsuhiko Nakajima and Tomohiro Ishii, both of whom would later go on to be big stars. That's it, and frankly you're clutching at straws there. Well, that and it makes for a pretty engrossing story, doesn't it? And with that, it's time to bring this trilogy of defunct Puro disasters to an end. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I'm sure there'll be some more fun to come. But until then, bye for now.